Hi, and welcome to episode 52 of Tennis Volley Talk. Today, what I'm going to be doing is doing my 52nd episode, which actually is my 1 year episode of doing my YouTube tennis podcast. And this week, who I interviewed over the phone is actually from a tennis racket that I have in my collection that was actually from the state of Minnesota where I live now. And it was from Woodhill Country Club in Wayzata, Minnesota. And then I have a guy that I interviewed that knows the history of the Woodhill Tennis Club, and also on that tennis racket was signed Frank Voigt on that tennis racket, which I will be showing that tennis racket to you, and then also I will have a racket of the day for you podcasters out there. For you YouTubers, if you want to subscribe and like and make a comment on my YouTube podcast, feel free to do so. And I also, for you podcasters, if you want to see what I'm talking about with the racket and look at it, you can always go to my YouTube tennis podcast, Tennis Volley Talk, if you want to do that. Also with that too, I will be getting to this interview, and I will then pause it too at certain times to let you see let you know where I was in my tennis career and stuff. So, and then along the way, I'll be showing you some pictures that I was sent of Frank Voigt, and a little bit of the story of how he became Mr. Tennis in Minnesota. So I just wanted to let you know that. And I will show you a few pictures of him also. So without any further delays, I'll turn the interview on, and we'll take it from there. And thank you for joining me back on Tennis Volley Talk. And today, my 52nd episode, been doing it a year. Today, actually, I'm going to be doing an over-the-phone interview with Went Richie from a guy that kind of knows a little bit about one of the rackets that I found in my collection, and it is actually from Woodhill Country Club. Woodhill Country Club has a very rich history in its own right here in Minnesota. And I just wanted to thank you again and joining me and taking time out of your schedule here, Went, to help me along and talk about the rich history of Woodhill Country Club there in Wayzata.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. Now, actually, it really kind of surprised me too, that has been around as long as it has, since really actually kind of founded, from what I gather, is about 1915. And then they did build a clubhouse for it back, and then in 1917 it was actually inaugurated as a club then at that time. So it's been around a long time there in Wayzata.
Yes, we had our 100th anniversary, about 8 years ago, and it's a family country club with a variety of venues to participate in sports and social activities. So it's been one of the major country clubs in the Twin Cities area for over a century.
That is really something in itself, to have that rich history and everything, and then from the beginnings that it was just amazing to me that it was the property that was purchased to make that club back there was actually a farm, Dunwoody, which is a well-known name in Minnesota.
Minnesota anyway. With a college that they have for Institute for Technology and kind of like that. But I kind of gathered with all the acreage that they purchased for that. It was amazed to me that it ended up being somewhere roughly at about 760 acres. But back then, it only purchased for that big amount for back then at $65,000 is what it was all purchased for. For all that acreage to start building on that site.
Yeah, correct. Actually, my grandfather was one of the original founders, and he acted as president, vice president, secretary, treasurer for many years. And it's interesting, I'm not the club historian by any stretch of the imagination, but looking at the historical notes in our club, the handbook, I was surprised to read the fact that the founders wanted to establish a club that was free from the temptations of drink.
Oh my gosh!
So yeah, free from temptations of drink back in the early 1900s. Yeah, that was an interesting part of it too. So it was a liquor-free location or clubhouse for that club back then for doing that. But what an interesting way to set up the founding ways of that. That's the way they wanted that club to go at that time.
One of the guiding principles, and that lasted until Prohibition ended in 1934. And if only our founders could look a century ahead and see how that issue has changed quite substantially.
Oh, I'm sure it has. Oh my gosh, once that ended, then boy, they could go and relax and have their wine per se.
That's right. And so the social part is it's a big part. So it's an all-purpose family club, and it's a generational membership that is unique, and it's been part of our family's life from the beginning.
Oh sure.
It's a place where we call our second home.
Oh sure. And then did it always have tennis courts, or I did also read that it was also an equestrian club or riding club or something like that at one time. But when did the tennis courts come into being built for that club at the time?
Well, it started as a golf course, and Donald Ross, the famous Scottish architect, was the architect in 1917, and then he, I think, revisited the club in 1934, where he tweaked the course. So it started mainly as that, and as a riding club. It was a riding club until, from the 1920s until 1961. There were horse shows, very prominent horse shows up in the Midwest area, where riders from all over came, and many members of Woodhill partook in that, and they had their own horses, and there was 2 barns, I think, one of which remains now, that is our winter sports barn, all-purpose sports barn that is the center of paddle tennis and hockey and ice skating and social, which we
So that's where I kind of started. About 68 is when I started my tennis back in junior high. And then when they made those last courts there, of course, I was in Oklahoma at the time. But with that too, they had made like in 72 was the last time, the last courts that they made there. So yeah, I was full into my few years into my tennis career at the time, from junior high and then going into high school is when I was doing that and starting to play my tennis back in that time.
The last four courts, I've got to think here. The last four courts in '63 and '72, there was a big hill. The courts are on top of the property on a hill, so you have to walk up the long hill or drive up in the back side. But before the last four courts were built, there was a huge hill that overlooked some of the courts, and that's where we watched some of the exhibition matches. And that was torn down to make room for the four courts that were installed in '63 and '72. So there are 10 hard-true courts that are now been established, and they used to have lights that illuminated the first four courts, and then those got taken out because nobody plays at night anymore. But so that's the physical makeup is there. 10 courts, and there's a tennis shop with restrooms, and that was built back in the '70s and '80s. But there were a number of iterations as far as the tennis shop. It started with just one tiny little shop where Frank Voigt, which is our pro from 1942 to 1980, and the subject of this podcast, where he would string rackets and conduct his business. But it was a tiny little shop, and there's been a number of iterations to expand that and place it in different spots.
Kind of reminds me, though, of where I grew up in Tulsa, the La Fortune Tennis Center. Same kind of situation. A little tiny brick building for a tennis shop, a little tennis desk, a little tennis shop. That's kind of where they strung the rackets back then. It was a little kind of a brick building. Last it started, it was there, like when it was built, started going in the early 70s, 71, 72, something like that. But kind of reminds me a little bit of how I went and was around that kind of stuff with that small kind of a shop back then too.
More serviceable, a full-time tennis shop.
Sure. And what about you? Were you a Minnesota guy all the time? And then how the tennis bug hit you, per se?
Well, my family, as I say, my grandfather was one of the original founders and officers of the club for many years. And so our family was members, and as a young child, I learned to play tennis and hockey at Woodhill. There's down by where we have the bar, and there's a pond, and there's almost been hockey rinks there, so that's part of the sports complex. So tennis was the, golf and hockey, but tennis was, because of Frank Voigt, it was kind of the heart and soul of the club, and everybody took lessons. And as a child, we all learned how to play tennis and use classic strokes that Frank taught us, a la Don Budge and Kenny Rosewall, and Jack Kramer. It's a classic style of tennis.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and Frank Voigt, he knew all of those guys because he was actually on the pro tour back in the time that they were on the pro tour too. So he was and played with those guys, the Don Budges and the Jack Kramers and the Bill Tildens, and was able to be around that also through that time.
Absolutely.
That you don't see anymore.
No, you really don't.
So we all learned that at a young age, and I actually spent most of my summers playing tennis with all of my friends. And eventually, as a sophomore, junior in high school, Frank asked me to work for him in the tennis shop, stringing rackets and mending the phone, doing some of the billing. And that lasted for 4 or 5 years. My brother Chuck, was in the shop before I was for 4 or 5 years. So
now here is a little bit of a picture of some of the tennis rackets that. Well, let's see if I can get it. There we go. So yeah, that's a little bit of the tennis racket pictures that I have. The two are a Frank Voigt signed signature tennis racket. The other one up above there either looks like another Wilson racket or an A.G. Spalding racket, one of the two, but it's probably a Wilson racket. I have one similar to that myself in my collection. And but anyway, that's a few of the rackets that they have in there at the club that were the rackets that they have for on display.
Stringing rackets and mending the phone, doing some of the billing, and that lasted for 4 or 5 years. My brother Chuck, was in the shop before I was for 4 or 5 years. So we were fully involved with the operations of tennis, and of course we got to know Frank and what a special person he was, what an impact he made on our lives and everybody's life in Woodhill and beyond in the tennis community in the Northwest tennis area.
Yeah, and it just amazes me that that the way he, and to me, I think that a lot of that stuff should go back to really the classic strokes, because it's so different nowadays with all the power and all the rackets that they have. But the traditional one-handed backhand, traditional, I'm a one-hander, I grew up one-hander, never could get used to two-hander, so.
I hear you. I feel your pain.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh my gosh, that one-hander, but then sometimes it just is, you can be so on with it, and then sometimes that one-hander can go haywire and go south so easy.
Well,
Yeah, and that's where right now my one-hander is non-existent for some reason. I just can't seem to get used or even hit a one-handed backhand nowadays. I don't know why, but anyway, for you YouTubers out there, if you want to make a comment and or subscribe to my channel, Tennis Volley Talk on YouTube, and you podcasters out there, you'll be seeing a racket of the day and seeing the racket that I have that was signed by Frank Voigt back in the day, probably in the late 50s, early 50s to early 60s is when this racket was around and was sold to someone out of the Woodhill Country Club. So just kind of an interesting aspect of that racket in itself.
About the time Frank retired, the game, I think, had advanced to, the different kinds of rackets, composite rackets and aluminum rackets. And that story a lot better than I, but the stringing and everything. And then the game became high powered with,
Oh yeah, nothing but, and then you had the few serving volleys like Patrick Rafter and then Sampras, but then those were basically the true serving volleyers. Nowadays, the only one that I can really think that's a serving volley all the time is Maxim Cressy on the Pro Tour, but he's been injured, so I haven't been able to watch that pure serving volley game and stuff. I wish I could serve and volley, but I used to kind of, but then for some reason my feet just freeze at the baseline, and I hit from the baseline. I'm going, why don't I just go in and try to serve a volley? But my much over the years with the membership that it has, as to the families and then the members back when it was formed. It was roughly about 63, but it's exponentially grown with membership over the years through that, and everything too. And then, they kind of a little, with that aspect too, to have that, the history of that club and having the families that belong to it, and then learned actually from Frank Voigt, and learning the strokes that he taught them too.
Now, here's a picture of, if I can get it here and not get it so glary. Anyway, that's a picture of Frank Voigt there. And so anyway, he's actually right there, probably holding one of his rackets that he had signed by his signature. But that's a picture of Frank Voigt back in the early days, probably in the 50s or so, something like that, 60s.
And as we speak of that, I'm actually looking at the racket that I have that is actually signed with his signature on it, and with the symbol of the Woodhill Country Club in Wayzata, Minnesota. So, and I actually ended up having a friend of mine that gave me a bunch of rackets at the time, and then when I've been going and sorting them out and hanging them up on my rack, for my racks that I have for my rackets, I came across this and I said, well, my gosh, what the heck, from Wayzata. I went, well, then I called Wayzata Club, and then I said, well, yeah, I got this racket, and it's signed by a Frank, and I couldn't read the last name very well because it was kind of fancy there, and Frank Voigt something, and then somebody got back to me and went, oh, Frank Voigt, you mean? And then here I have this racket, and then that's then how I got in touch with you. They gave me your name and to kind of go over a little bit of the history of the rich history of the club itself, and then plus with Frank, he must have been, him growing up in Florida and teaching where he taught in Florida, and then also growing up in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, to be able to, back in the day when he was teaching, starting teaching and playing, to actually have played with all the likes of Budge and Tilden, and teaching the Kennedys how to play tennis, and even teaching and playing and hitting with Ginger Rogers, that he said that was actually a very good tennis player, he said.
And he said Fred Astaire wasn't so good because he was always afraid to hurt his feet.
Oh yeah, gotta protect the feet there.
Exactly. Well, Frank Voigt is he's an icon. He was the heart and soul of Northwest tennis for all the years he resided here in Minnesota. He started out learning tennis from his uncles, James
So yeah, he was a very legitimate tennis player, and knowing and having the classic strokes that he did, actually being able to hit and play with those legends at the time, and then plus being able to teach, and he also actually taught all the Kennedys how to play tennis. He said that John wasn't. He was okay, but not as good as what his brother was. And they said that Joe was the youngest one, or the one, Joe Kennedy. He was actually a pure athlete and was a very good tennis player. But yeah, to be able to even play and grow up and teach those stars, the movie stars, in along the way, and that's how he grew up from Newport, Rhode Island, then to going to Miami and or near in Florida, and Miami Beach, and to be able to teach and play with the movie stars that came through there too during the day or during that time.
But she's a legitimate top end player, and you never saw the professional tennis game very much when we were growing up because he was always teaching. He was on the court 8 hours a day, teaching old, teaching young, but you saw the smoothness and the eloquence of his game, of his strokes, of his footwork.
Oh,
It was classic. It was just classic.
Oh my gosh!
So that's what drew practically every member of Woodhill to the tennis courts, and that's where the action was in the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Tennis was it.
Oh yeah, and I grew up. I grew up in Oklahoma, but I grew up in the 70s myself. Well, really started tennis about 68 back in junior high, but then it got in my blood and played with friends of mine, and then made it over to the tennis courts at the high school, and then couldn't have grown up with a better bunch of older guys that kind of took us under the young whippersnappers under their wings to play with that group of guys, and lifelong friendships through tennis with the younger and older generation. And you just didn't really see, nowadays some of that stuff doesn't quite exist with knowing the older generation like some people should. Like we grew up knowing that and learning and growing up with that generation too.
Yeah.
And with that picture that I just showed you, you could just see the pure nice form that he had on the court to hit that ball like he did. Just looks like he was really took it to heart and knew how to hit that ball in a classic way.
It was quite something. There was some articles that said, in 1955, he and Rich Gornto, who took over from Frank at the Baton Tennis Club. Frank moved permanently to Wayzata in 1955.
And of course, then that's the year that I was around first. So yeah, the year he moved to Wayzata, and that was the year that I was born. So and he probably couldn't have been much more than 20, mid-20s, maybe 30 at the time. Whenever he moved to Wayzata.
They lost to Budge and Bobby Briggs. But it was close. It was like 8-6 or something like that.
Oh sure.
Other articles where he and his partner beat Bobby Briggs and somebody else. So he was in that group. He could play with that group, but his passion was teaching, and he was a great communicator. And he
bulb go off in their head to know, oh, that's how you hit. Okay.
Yeah. I want to add too that his impact wasn't only on the tennis court. He was a gentleman, but boy, he had his boundaries, and if you crossed them, he was very firm.
Oh gosh.
I just wanted to interject here that tennis etiquette was very, very important for him, was paramount. Even today, when we see people walk across somebody else's court to get when they're done.
Oh yeah.
And that court's in play. Frank, if he saw anybody like that, he would take them aside and say, that's not etiquette, that's not going to happen again. And we all remember that. And today, when we play tennis, we see that happening.
Oh yeah.
I can't help but thinking about, Frank would pull that person across and over and talk to him and say, that's not how you do it.
Yeah, not how you do it.
For years there, we had junior tournaments of the Northwest Tennis Association.
Oh, sure.
From all over the tri-state area. People didn't know who Frank was or whatever. And you get some kids acting out as teenage testosterone and getting demonstrating a little poor behavior. In no uncertain terms would Frank call him out and set him straight, saying this is not how the game is played.
Oh, sure.
I've had a number of friends and acquaintances, non-Woodhill members that have taken lessons from Frank or been part of the junior tennis programs that recalled being mentored, shall we say, by Frank as to what's proper.
Or what you could call or say a stern talking to back in the day of how that etiquette should work with the tennis.
And was not, and that was paramount in his lifestyle.
Oh, I'm sure.
And just being a gentleman.
Oh, yeah.
And he had an impact on many people in that effect.
Yeah, and just to be able to be people that were able to be taught by him, just probably value that teaching to this very day.
There are members of Woodhill that are, they're now my age, older, that by Frank, their grandchildren have been taught by Frank, are the grandchildren. Everybody knows who Frank was that had a chance to be part of his life. He was when he was teaching at Woodhill.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh. He was in a way when he came to Minnesota and started teaching and in a sense doing what he did and teaching the way he did and having so many pupils and having so many people that he taught just became probably known as Mr. Tennis in Minnesota.
He was looked upon by all the tennis pros that grew up and worked here from all the different clubs. You ask any of those pros, anybody that goes back to that age, Jack Roach comes to mind, David Yorks, many people that of my age or maybe a little older that knew Frank and knew him as a peer in the tennis professional.
about this guy that I have his autograph on a racket. So that really kind of makes it well worth having this for my year episode. This has been really so great to be able to learn all of this with the club and also about Frank himself.
Now the racket itself. When I was working there and before, I mean, he had the signature racket well before I was there in the 60s. So I would say probably in the 50s, he had, it's a Jack Kramer racket frame.
Oh, okay.
He was a very good friend of Jack Kramer. Kramer would come up and have exhibitions here at Woodhill.
Oh my gosh.
Plenty of pictures we have of Jack, and even Don Budge was here once, I think, as well. But he had Wilson, Jack Kramer was a Wilson racket. He had them put his signature on it with a Woodhill stamp, and that was the classic wood racket. And every couple weeks he'd send me into the Wilson warehouse in St. Louis Park, and we'd pick up a whole new bunch of rackets and bring them back and string them up for the members.
Okay.
But it's a Jack Kramer frame. It's the same frame as Jack Kramer had, just had Frank's signature on it.
Oh, that is amazing in itself and how that came, to be able to go to the who was the Wilson rep back in the day, though, that you went to see?
Good friend. He was a left-handed player that played with. His name was Norm McDonald.
Okay.
That crowd was maybe remember some of these names, at least those, and grew up in the tennis area in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Norm McDonald, Kenny Boyum, Bill Kuras, who had grown up in a cabin. Those were kind of the local amateur pros.
Okay.
And those were Frank's, contemporaries in a good way on the local scene.
Sure.
But Norman was the rep.
Okay. Did he not have a tennis shop of his own? So up there in Minneapolis at one time, or
Norm?
Yeah.
He might have. I'm a little foggy in that.
So Norm McDonald was the Wilson rep, and so then interesting thing behind that is that being a Jack Kramer frame, the frame that Jack Kramer played with, Frank Voigt actually had the stamp of the club on it, and then signed his name, and they had it the way they did it, and went in and picked him up. So then they sold that particular racket with Frank's autograph on it out of that club at Woodhill Club, with that. So also with you YouTubers, be sure and subscribe and like my channel. Also, you podcasters, if you want to see the racket of the day coming up, I actually got a 2-for-1 special today. Going to show you the racket that was Frank, that they sold at the club under Frank's name, and then also a racket of the day that you can take a look at on my YouTube tennis channel, Tennis Volley Talk.
I think he was clearly involved in the design of the tennis game. And I'd have to do some research, but I think he did. I
think so too, because I have a friend of mine. That is, and you may know the name too, that runs an Elk River tennis tournament each summer up in Elk River. That just now is some part owner of the Rogers Tennis Club, Randy Bonning.
Yeah, I don't know the name.
Okay. Yeah, but he's part owner of the new Rogers Tennis Club up there in Rogers. But I've known him for years and years. But I think he dealt with Norm McDonald quite a bit too during the day in buying rackets. And then I think I actually went to that shop one time, and he had a plethora of collection of tennis rackets too.
Yeah.
That he had on the wall or somewhere that he was showing.
Yeah, you're on the right track. I think he did have a shot.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it was amazing in itself. I mean, it was many years ago, but I kind of remember that it was somewhere down 32nd and Franklin or something like that in Minneapolis. So, but yeah, and then he's eventually retired and all that. But still, to know that he himself, was the rep and was able to put the frames and the rackets, and they have Frank, have Frank assign those rackets too, to be able to sell them to it, and then have the Woodhill Stamp on them to have the members buy them too. So somewhere along the way, I ended up getting one, which is really kind of a value in itself too.
Well, I'm glad you delved into this area, and it's bringing you some pleasure, because it's certainly there isn't a Woodhill member that didn't have a Frank Voigt racket. I mean, that's basically all we sold. That's all I strung up.
Oh, that's amazing in itself. And it still has a full complement of strings in it too. And I'm sure that it's back from then, the classic nylon string. The classic nylon, almost.
We strung it up with nylon and then strung it up with gut.
Yeah.
We got Victor gut from Norm McDonald.
Oh, sure.
And we'd have to go out and we'd stretch the gut. We'd put it around a pole.
Oh my gosh.
Around our waist, and we'd pull it.
Oh my goodness.
Stretch it out before we string it. Frank was an expert stringer, and he taught all the shop brother, me, and those that followed. String rackets. We did it the old-fashioned. We did it with you cut off a handle of an old tennis racket, and you use the leather handle to tighten the string. You wrap it, go through the hole, and wrap it around the handle, and you kind of like touching field. You'd say, "This is the right." You put the awl in the hole, and you go to the next rope.
Oh, that is amazing. That's some classic stringing right there. That is so cool.
None of this high technology.
Oh, heck no.
All touching.
None of this high-tech multi stuff. You just did it by feel. And that is amazing in itself. And the let alone to know that those rackets were strung tight also, by that way.
Yeah. Frank would say, all right, how do you want this one? If it were my racket. Or he said, no, now how would Mrs. Pillsbury, well, we better string this a little, not quite so tight. He'd know people's games.
Oh, God.
Well enough to say, okay, let's not go full amount on it. Let's give him a little slack.
Yeah, and back then, that what they were stringing with back then, and what he's talking about, was the Calgut or catgut that they strung rackets with back in the day. So yeah, that is amazing in itself. And then eventually in the later times, whenever the stringing machines came out, and then they had the nylon strings, then that's how they strung the rackets. Then with the nylon, and I have probably the 60s, 50s, 60s, and it was probably done on a stringer machine. With that.
He was a master.
Oh my gosh. And for him to be able to teach like the people that he did, because of the club who was there as members, like the Pillsbury family or the Dayton family or anything like that. Amazing in itself that he knew their games that well.
He knew everybody. Everybody knew Frank, and he was loved by him for good reasons.
Oh, I'm sure he was. I'm sure. Absolutely, he sounds like such a wonderful all-around person to be able to take lessons from and know the classicness and to actually then have that input will you be able to talk to me on Tennis Volley Talk for my year episode?
I appreciate being invited, and all I can say is that Frank has made a great impact on our family's lives and everybody that he came in contact with, and it's a pleasure it's always a pleasure to go back and review some of his history, and it's just very heartwarming.
Well, I appreciate your time so much, and I might even have to try to put this racket and go over to Woodhill and talk to him about putting it on loan for me. I'll loan it to you so you can display it.
You come by anytime, call me anytime, and come on over, and then we'll introduce you to the game of hot tennis.
Oh yes, that would be cool. I would like that. I'll do that. I appreciate the invite.
Anytime.
Okay.
We're open 24/7 when the weather permits.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I do thank you again, Went, and you enjoy getting out there when it starts getting warmer, and we can get some outside tennis in then.
I'd love to do that.
All right.
Thanks, Brett.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Well, that was it, and I will be putting this on YouTube, and thank you very much for listening.
So that was it. That was the interview with that. And without wanting to show you the racket that I have is the Frank Voigt racket, and signed by Frank back in the day, and probably this way, Frank Voigt, and it was signed by him. That's the symbol of the Woodhill Country Club in Wayzata, Minnesota, and that's the symbol that they put on the racket. And then, of course, he signed here with the racket, and then it does. I mean, yeah, you look at it, and this racket here has the nylon strings in it. Still tight as all heck, still pretty tight, and the nylon strings and everything. But with that racket too, it very much looks to be probably in the 50s to 60s racket, and then it does have that very similar frame like the Jack Kramer frame on the Jack Kramer rackets too. So yeah, with that, this was the racket that he endorsed, and he signed from Wilson that gave these rackets to him, and he signed them, and they did it that way to where he had his autograph on it. And then they sold it out of the Woodhill Country Club, this particular racket. So somewhere along the way, somebody ended up buying this racket and passed along to other people and through other people. And I ended up getting it, and I am very happy and very glad that I did get this racket so I could get some more rich history of tennis all the way around. And with that is that Frank Voigt racket there for you to take a look at there. And then with this also, for you YouTubers, be sure and like and subscribe and make a comment if you did like the racket of the day too. You podcasters, be sure and look on my YouTube tennis podcast channel, Tennis Volley Talk, if you want to take a look at that racket. Now with another one, here is a racket of the day here. This is actually a Wright Ditson tennis racket made by Wright Ditson. Now, Wright Ditson was founded in 1871 by a businessman, a baseball player, George Wright, and a businessman, Henry Ditson, and then Spalding bought them out in 1891, but the Wright Ditson symbol stayed on the and endorsed their making of the rackets and everything like that up until 1940s or so in that area. But also it has the little sticker on here, this little blue sticker here. It says made Wright and Ditson makers, made in USA. And that's what that sticker says here. And then of course it has a brass screw in it for balance wise, the balance point of the racket itself right there. And then it's called the Davis Cup racket. Now this racket is also then probably all strung by either cat or cowgut, either one. And it has the strings up here and at the bottom for the knots or smooth for spinning the racket too. But this racket here, it has faded some colors on it. It's, with the handle too. But, back in the day, it probably had some nice colors on it too. The blue was probably really nice blue. But this racket, I would say probably is from probably in the early 30s, maybe late 20s, but at least I know early 30s, 40s in that area, probably in the mid 20s maybe with that racket. And the Davis Cup racket is, then that's probably just the form of the name of a Davis Cup and Wright Ditson racket. Not sure if it was a Wilson or Spalding racket or anything like that, but it was very much the Wright Ditson symbol on it. It was actually sold somewhere out of a tennis shop or on a sporting goods store back in the day, and probably in that time called Ambrose Sporting Goods, but I'm not quite sure exactly where it's from. I couldn't read what city it was in, but back in the day, back in the early time in the 30s, 40s, the sporting goods stores sold these Wright Ditson rackets. And so that's what they sold back in the day. And very, very, very nice or very heavy feeling racket though, too, sturdy. So that would be the racket of the day for you YouTubers to take to see. And then also if you podcasters want to take a look at it, then feel free to do that on my tennis volley talk on YouTube. So anyway, with that, I do thank all of my TVT tennis friends that are listening too. And thank you again. And once that weather starts turning towards the warm for the people that are playing inside now, look forward to the outside circuit during the summer circuit. So everybody have a nice week, and I will talk to you next week. And thank you very much for being with me for a year and seeing and watching my year 52nd episode. Thank you very much and have a good week.